Everyone, so we're going to continue here with our domains starting in eukarya. So we're going to talk about protists today. So algae is really the foundation of all marine life, but what you don't know about algae is that they're actually protists. So many people misconstrued that and take them as plants, but that is not true. They are protists. And the really interesting thing about this is that they are equivalent to this plant in the ocean. So there is a lot of algae in the ocean and a lot of plants, but a lot of the different organisms here, you may not know which is which. So another interesting thing here, though, is that this algae or these protists account for 90% of the photosynthesis and oxygen production on Earth. So it's a huge amount coming from just this one group of protists with all these different types here. So it's really important to remember, definitely highlight this last bullet here. 90% of photosynthesis is and oxygen production for Earth are coming from these algae or these protists. So the first type of protist that we're going to talk about are diatoms. So these are the most productive photosynthesizing plankton in the ocean. Now remember, plankton are just things that float with the current. So these diatoms, these protists are the most productive, so they're making the most amount of oxygen, the most amount of sugars out of the other comparisons here. They are slightly larger than bacteria, and they are going to photosynthesize. As we know, they're most productive. And another important thing is that they reproduce very rapidly. So 2 weeks or more, in 2 weeks, there's going to be more than 1 million diatoms that coming from one single parent. So obviously that reproduction rate is very high. But remember, they are larger than bacteria, but not necessarily very large. So that's why we can allow for that huge reproduction rate here. And also remember that these diatoms are going to be very important in the food cycle here. So it's important that they reproduce quickly so they can be eaten and used for energy in that way. So if we take a look, we can see that these have some very interesting shapes to them. So they're not all the same. They're very different shapes. Some are larger, some are smaller. But again, remember, they are going to be larger than bacteria, but not necessarily large enough to not be microscopic. So it really depends on the diatom that we're talking about. So dinoflagellates, these are the second most productive photosynthesizers in the ocean. And something really interesting is back when we talked about coral reefs, we talked about something giving the coral its color, because coral is actually transparent. This is what's going to be giving that coral some of the color it is, and it's also providing food for those polyps as well. And probably the most interesting thing here is that these dinoflagellates are bioluminescent. They emit light when agitated due to a special enzyme they have. And I want to encourage you to take a look at that YouTube video that I have linked there to really show how those move. But let's take a look at some of these pictures. So again, pretty unique shapes here as well. But if we take a look at this bioluminescence, anything that can move it around, like waves crashing in the ocean, someone swimming, a kayaker, you're going to see that bioluminescence here. So let's talk about some different types of algae here. So toxic red tides, these are going to be created by those dinoflagellates and produce some of the most toxic substances known, more toxic than cyanide. So these toxins will accumulate inside of the fish and other different organisms within the ocean and actually cause those animals to die. Or if those animals can sustain, it could actually injure the person or the other animals that are eating those fish or shellfish. So these are actually pretty dangerous, so you have to be sure, but it's hard to tell the difference sometimes between these red tides, toxic red tides and just regular red tides. So you have to really pay attention to your news and everything else and what people are telling you. And the reason that these red tides are happening is because the weather and ocean conditions are at the right balance, that it allows this massive bloom of these protists, causing those red tides. So it has to be a right balance to allow that bloom to happen, or else it doesn't actually happen. So if we take a look here, we can see that this red tide is just really going to actually change the surface color of the ocean, change that to a red color. And we can see here, many fish have been affected by this red tide. Many have died, which is really going to affect food chains and things like that. So you have to be very careful, especially with humans. It is toxic to us as well. So our next type is red algae. Remember, these are protists. This is actually the most common that we're going to see, and it's known as seaweed. So you might have thought of seaweed as a plant, but it is not. It's actually a protist. But they are going to photosynthesize the same way as a land plant might. So they're going to take in energy through their leaves, per se, and bring that energy around just like normal. So I'm sure many people are familiar with what seaweed looks like. So we can see these long kind of flap-like seaweed, and then we can also see some of our seagrass looking type protists in the bottom here. So this is going to be our green algae. Again, they are protists. Red algae as well, also protists, but something interesting here is that they can actually live in deeper waters. This is because they don't need that light that green algae need. They can absorb a light that can penetrate deeper into the water, which is why they're able to survive deeper into that water. This red algae is going to be really, really important for coral reefs. It acts like a cement. We do remember back when we talked about coral reefs that they are pretty fragile animals. So having this extra cement-like structure to help them come together is going to be really important here. And then some types are actually harvested, dried, and eaten in your sushi. So that's an interesting fact here as well. So we can see, I personally think it kind of looks like red cabbage under the water, which is pretty interesting as well. But again, we can see all these different types here. Again, remember that these are protists, not plants. And then last one we're going to talk about is brown algae. So brown algae, more commonly known as kelp, have these really large leathery blades that are going to be held up and float in the water due to some gas structures that are within those. So we're going to see these really large rafts in a second, and those are called sargassum. And those are really interesting because you might think of kelp forests and all those different things in the ocean. Again, many of us might have thought those were plants in the beginning, but they are not. They're actually these protist structures. So protists, you can see, are not just a single-celled organism like we might have seen with those diatoms, but they can be really large organisms and hold up to these different, what I would say, plant-like attributes here. So we take a look at some of our brown algae here. We can see these really large raft-like kelp forests, allowing for those animals to hide in them, feed from them, all those different things. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll see you next time.